Welcome to episode 55 of the Princeton Podcast, produced by the podcast production team at HG Media, providing audio and video production services here in Princeton since 1999. In this episode, our Princeton Podcast host, Mayor Mark Freda, welcomed Richard Rein, editor of TAPinto Princeton and a lifelong Princeton area newspaper journalist. In their conversation, Rich shared the origins of his journalism career, reflecting on his early inspiration and passion for storytelling. He discussed his experiences at the Daily Princetonian and Time magazine, his founding and editing of US1 Newspaper for more than 35 years, and his current work with TAPinto Princeton. Rich offered insights into the value of local journalism, the role of community involvement, and his thoughts on the evolving media landscape in Princeton. So without any further introduction, let's join our host, Mark Freda, and his guest, Richard Rein, for episode 55 of the Princeton Podcast.
Rich, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Good to hear. All right, so let's start out with, Rich, what attracted you to a career in journalism?
I can remember the moment pretty vividly when my father said to me, Rich, you're going to need to do something other than just get grades in school. You got to have some sort of outside activity. So I would suggest maybe you learn how to play the piano, or maybe you go and work on the school newspaper. And I had my mother played the piano. One of my older sisters played the piano. I looked at that and I said, that's way too complicated. That is not going to work. But I said, that school newspaper thing sounds good. So I did. And I got interested in it right away. And I think what intrigued me and what I found rewarding was that without really being an expert in anything, you could become an expert. You could play the expert. And it really played out. I was an incredible sports fan, but a lousy athlete. So I never made the high school football team. Was even not allowed to try out for the high school football team. Couldn't play, was able to play soccer maybe. But I got a job right after high school, a summer job, working at the local newspaper in upstate New York. And I covered sports. And so there I was, right? Couldn't be one of the athletes, but could be right there with them. And that has followed through in the journalism career. You can be an expert, make yourself an expert, and sometimes you can even make a difference. So that's a nice feeling.
Yeah, that's great to hear. So tying into that, a little about you. You mentioned high school and everything. Yeah. Where did you grow up?
This all happened in upstate New York, up in the Triple Cities, Binghamton, Endicott, Johnson City. I was one of 5 kids, and both my parents were high school educated, but knew the value of education. So as my father is an example, asked me to do things outside of school, just to broaden my experiences. And then heard about Princeton University because a kid on my paper route, who is also an avid sports fan, told me that there was a kid at Princeton who was setting an incredible record for free throws in college basketball games. And he was up toward 55 consecutive free throws without a miss. And I said, really? Who's this guy? And he said, it's a guy named Bill Bradley. And so that put Princeton on my radar, and I was lucky enough to get admitted, and here I am.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
So is that when you first came to Princeton to go to the university?
My first visit in Princeton was in September of 1965, freshman week. I applied here. I never came to visit. I said, what could be wrong with Princeton? It looks good, sounds good. They had a guy named Cosmo Iacovazzi playing football who was from Scranton, and which was right down the road from Binghamton. His father owned a junkyard in Scranton. And I said, gee, if a guy like Cosmo could do well there, and then they got a guy like Bradley, he's off the charts, what could be wrong with it? So I showed up sight unseen, and it worked out.
It's amazing. And so I believe while at the university, you also were connected with the Daily Princetonian?
Yes, I was. That was my one activity at Princeton, and I threw myself into the Princetonian, sometimes to the detriment of my academic studies. There were occasional bad moments there, but I threw myself into the Princetonian, and then became my junior and senior year, my last full year on the Princetonian, I became the chairman of the Princetonian, which is basically the editor-in-chief. And that opened a few doors to continue that journalism career. So I was really on a roll. went from Princeton immediately. Even in the summer of 1968, I got a summer internship with Time magazine, and they sent me out to Chicago, which was the scene of the 1968 Democratic Convention. So there was another chance of not being an expert, not being a politician, but I could go there and watch those guys in action. So it was an exciting time.
What a great opportunity.
Yeah.
So I did a little research on you, and I saw that you had written at one point, hey, here's some of the things I've done in my life. And you spent some time working in Pittsburgh.
Oh, boy. I knew somebody would find out about Pittsburgh sooner or later. I have mentioned that on occasion. And it was my one time when I ventured out of journalism. I thought I'd been doing all this summer jobs, Daily Princetonian, Time magazine, and a guy came to me with an opportunity to work for a landscape architect based in Pittsburgh who was helping with the Pittsburgh Renaissance. Pretty progressive guy, had a lot of bright ideas, and he needed help. He needed a writer to help him write a book. And I got there, got settled in, and it quickly became clear that he actually did not want a writer to help him write a book. He said he did, but he was leery of writers. He didn't want to really share any of his information. So basically, I sat around at this job in Pittsburgh for about 9 months and got fired. And people would ask me, gosh, what did you do? And my answer was nothing. That's why I got fired. Absolutely nothing. But that actually turned out to be untrue. I did do some reading at his suggestion. I read some books about the environment. And one of the books I read was The Last Landscape by a guy named William H. White. And White was still famous then for writing a book called The Organization Man back in the 1950s. And I read this book, The Last Landscape, and it was about land preservation. People were afraid of suburban sprawl, and countryside was being bulldozed and turned into housing developments, concerns that remain with us till this day, as Mark.
Yeah.
But I read it, and interestingly enough, he didn't just talk about the rural landscape and the open countryside. He also talked about the urban landscape. And he said, one way we can preserve these great open spaces that we have is to work better in our downtowns and in our urban areas and move the growth there. So I learned some valuable lessons from White and then decided to stay in journalism. And I ended up back in Princeton working for a semester as the assistant to the guy who was teaching journalistic writing at the time. He was a predecessor to John McPhee. And I worked for him, and in the course of doing that, I found out that I could actually live for free at the Daily Princetonian building. The janitor there, with whom I had a nice working relationship with, said, "Hey, Rich, you could live we got some abandoned offices up on the 4th floor. You could live there and not spend any money." And I think that's called squatting. And so that's what I did. And even then, as a freelance writer, which I decided I would try, there wasn't much income. But I thought if I could save money on housing in a town like Princeton, this would be a pretty good place. So I did that. I did that for about 2 years. And then finally, I got caught. And a very nice assistant dean there named Joe Moore said, it is time to move out. And I did. I got a room in a house on Bayard Lane next to what is now, even then, the Peacock Inn, and continued my freelance writing career and was eventually able to turn it into something more than that. Eventually I formed, from the freelance writing career, I went into US1. If I have time for one aside, I paid $80 a month for that room on Bayard Lane. And that was the low point for housing in Princeton, I thought. I went back recently because I was trying to see what was I really spending in 2024 dollars. And 80 was actually about $511 a month today. And I think back at it, would I rent that? I think I probably would spend $511 for that room today, but I think I couldn't find it. I think probably a room in a house might be, and I don't know what the market is here, but $1,000, $1,200? I'm not sure. I'm also not sure if anybody even rents a room out anymore, the way people used to back then. So I lived fairly frugally and did freelance writing. I was still working with some of the national publications, but I also worked for Town Topics. And the owner of Town Topics, a guy named Don Stewart, had followed my writing for the Alumni Weekly and for some other publications, and he needed somebody to come in and pinch hit when people would get sick or when they go on vacation. And he hired me to do that. And he was very generous, not only with his compensation, but he was also generous with his time and just tutored me in how a newspaper should run and why he made certain business decisions that he made. And I had no idea at the time that I would ever start a newspaper, but I just would sit around and listen, and we'd talk shop about why he did what he did, why his classifieds were unclassified, for example, other little quirks. So it was a fascinating learning experience. And actually, all of that set me up for what I did for the next 35 years or so.
Yeah.
US1.
Yeah. Which is a good thing to talk about.
Yeah. The idea for US1 came about at a little story meeting at Town Topics. And somebody was on vacation, and I was filling in for him. And it was the summer of 1984. And at the time, Scanacon, which was the hotel out of the Princeton Forrestal Center, now called the Marriott, I believe, was competing ferociously with the Hyatt Regency at Carnegie Center. And they're both brand new hotels, and what they were competing for was corporate travel business. So they wanted these new companies as they'd come in to come to their place with their corporate visitors and so on. And so they would have to show what they could do. They would have happy hour cocktail parties with food, free drink, and everything else. And I was a guy who would take a break. I often would go to one of the bars in town and sit around and have a drink at 5 o'clock. And guys at the bars were talking about these parties and how amazing they were. A, there was free food. B, there was free drinks. And it turned out all the corporate travel managers at all these companies up and down Route 1 were inevitably young women. So for a bunch of barflies sitting around in Princeton, guys, and there were a lot of guys back then in their late 20s, early 30s, trying to figure out what they were doing, maybe starting up a new business, whatever. We all thought, wow, we better go to this party. This sounds like a good time. Oh, and they would also have live bands. It was unbelievable. So I said to the people at Town Topics, there's this wonderful business story going on. And I explained what I just said. And I still remember Barbara Johnson, then the full-time reporter there, mother of Chris Reeve. Barbara said, that's not really, Scanacon is in Plainsboro, and the Hyatt is in West Windsor. That's really not a Princeton story. Yeah. And some people think that was a foolish remark by her, but actually it was pretty astute because Town Topics survived and has survived because they covered Princeton, and they didn't get sidelined by Plainsboro, and they didn't get sidetracked by West Windsor. So it was journalistically a smart thing to say. But at that point, a light went off in my head. I said, well, then maybe it's time for a Route 1 newspaper. And that's how I started up US1. I called it US1 because the inclination was to call it Route 1, but then half the world would say Route 1 and the other half would say Route 1. Yeah. And I said, I can't go on arbitrating route versus route. How about US1? So that worked.
So I think part of, from what I read when you were starting up US1, you had a lot of ideas and thoughts on growth and planning and what should be happening in the entire area. And it struck me that I thought you were ahead of your time on that. But what were you thinking at that time?
In some ways I was, and I was influenced by William H. White in The Last Landscape, I'm sure. And in some ways I thought that I took the advice of some people, Harry Sion and Sam Hamill, original founders of what was called the MSM Regional Conference, which later I think now is called New Jersey Future, and now is based in Trenton. But they said, think regionally, and that's really important. So I embraced that idea, and in that sense, that was ahead of its time. But I was also really behind my times in other ways. I bought a house on Moran Avenue in 1977. It had no parking. And I thought the towns, and there was, A, it had no parking. B, there was the no parking ban in all of Princeton Borough. And I thought that was the silliest thing, stupidest thing. And I fought to try to change that. And now I look back at it and say, I was a victim, a product of car culture. There I was. The car was all important. When I hear people today at a meeting saying, oh my gosh, where are they going to park the car? What's going to happen? I can empathize because I thought I was in that place myself. And I didn't realize how walkable the town was, and I didn't realize how much of our town planning has been dictated by the car. And when you break free of that mindset, you can see all sorts of other possibilities. So in that regard, I was behind the time, or I was with the time. Let's put it that way. It certainly wasn't. I was not progressive, and it took me a while to figure that out. I think I also figured out that you could plan for people and places, pedestrians, bicyclists. And you could also not lose the car. Clearly, nobody yet in Princeton. Few of us but maybe can, but most people really will need a car from time to time. Yeah. So we got to be pragmatic.
Yeah. Concentrating on US1 for just a couple more moments. Is there a favorite moment, article, or something tied to US1 that you recall?
Boy, there were a lot of them, and I have just completed, just within the last couple of weeks, I've completed a project that I'm doing with the Mudd Library at Firestone Library in Princeton University, and that is digitizing all of US1 from 1984 to the year 2020.
Wow.
So that's 36 years, 35 of which I was running the show. And so I'm a blur right now. So when you ask for one favorite one, I have just looked, really in the last year or so, I have literally opened and put my eyes on every single page. It's over 50,000 pages, I think 1,500 issues, something like that. Just this sea of US1. And there maybe were a couple that stand out. I really enjoyed the last issue I did, which came out on my 50th college reunion. And I did a reminiscence of the 4 years at Princeton University from 1965 to 1969. And if you couldn't have picked a 4-year period, I don't think, in which things changed more. But in 1965, we were no different from the undergraduates in 1955, or probably even 1945. If you look at the pictures of us, everything else. And in 1969, we were the bleak new future. It was dark. I even, on the cover of that issue, I put my freshman year picture, 8x10, glossy, clean shaven, short haired, necktie guy, along with the angry look from 1969, wire rim glasses, hair going in all directions. So that was a nice ending. And there were wonderful other stories that we did in between. They were not just business, but they were also sometimes having to do with entertainment and things that people could do around town. But it's really hard to pick one favorite child out of 1,500.
Yeah. No, I hear you. All right. So that leads me to your involvement with Princeton Future. There's a couple questions there. How did you connect with Princeton Future? But I also believe that you've written a book, and that ties into your activities with Princeton Future.
Yes. The US1 began to get, after 33 or 34 years, pushing 35, as it ended up being, began to be pretty predictable. It was always exciting, but you always knew that you were going to get through it. You're going to get another issue out. And the process that you went through would be unique, but on the other hand, it wouldn't really be that much different from the one that you did 20 years ago or 30 years ago. So I started looking around for other things to do. And quite by chance, I was walking down Nassau Street by Starbucks and then Landau's Clothing, and I saw a bunch of people putting in some sort of an installation at Dome Alley. And I looked in there and I said, gosh, this is like something. I said to these guys, this is something out of the William H. White playbook, because in that book, The Last Landscape, White had talked about all the little unused spaces in urban areas that could be repurposed into something more productive. And the guy on the ladder turned and looked at me and said, oh, Holly White is my hero. And that guy was Kevin Wilkes, who's well known around town. I think he might even have been on council at the time. Architect, building contractor, and so on. And Holly White, until then I didn't know that was the nickname for William Hollingsworth White. So Wilkes immediately made me go back and say, gee, has anybody written a book about Holly White, William H. White? And indeed there had not been. So I said, that's it, I'm going to do a biography of White. And that came out in 2022, and that's called American Urbanist. And that is still in print, went into paperback. It got well reviewed, and it was a great experience. in doing that work, I did some research, and it involved the archives of Princeton Future. And I was aware of the group. US1 had done a story on Sheldon Sturgis and the other people who had started Cork Park and that sort of thing on the thing that preceded, that took the place of an empty, unused parking lot before the Paul Robeson condominiums had been built. And there was a lot of squabbles going on with that one. A long time in coming.
Foundation, basically.
It sat there, and these guys, Kevin Wilkes, Peter Soderman, and some other guys, and Princeton Future helped out, had done that job. So I was aware of that and aware of Princeton Future, had to do some research, and Sheldon Sturgis said, I've got minutes of that meeting that from 10 years ago. Here you are. And so that was very helpful. So that just led to me starting to sit in at their meetings, seeing what they're doing, and then eventually if you sit in at a meeting long enough, then next thing you know, you find your name on what happened here?
You're sucked in.
Yeah, that's it.
So let's talk about TAPinto Princeton. How did that come about?
So at Princeton Future, one of the projects we started looking at was the unused, underutilized parking lot on Franklin Avenue. And I said, wow, there's a lot of ideas for this, a lot of ideas about housing. People wondered if 160 units could possibly fit on a space, and professional designers got involved, and they started showing us a multitude of ways that they could fit on that space. And I thought, this is a great story. I should write a op-ed on behalf of Princeton Future. And of course, we get it printed in Town Topics or whatever. And as much as I thought I knew Town Topics, because I went back 35 years with Town Topics, turns out they don't really print op-eds. And as an old print newspaper guy, I immediately said, yep, it makes sense, because op-eds can take an enormous amount of space. So they've got to buy extra pages, pay for extra printing. Then they've got to still drive it around in a car, throw it on a sidewalk. So there's a lot of overhead that goes into what we all think of as a simple op-ed. So they want letters limited to 500 words. Then I went to some of the other online news sites, and I got one reaction that said, yeah, Franklin Avenue. Would you think that an op-ed is in line there? I don't really like to cover Franklin Avenue because I don't like the way they're going about doing it. And I thought, 35 years of being in the newspaper business, there are a lot of things that I look at that I don't really like all that much, but you do the story on it.
You still do the story, yeah.
And so that seemed strange. So I thought maybe there's room here for an online, low overhead, digital, and daily contact with the world, because I was beginning to think that a lot of things happening in Princeton really deserved daily coverage. A lot of other stuff can wait a week. I'll be the first to admit it. And I long for those days when all of it could wait a week. But nowadays, there are things that people the next day or even that night, what happened? So I thought the daily component would be good. I found out about the TAPinto people, and I asked around about it, and it turned out Ingrid Reed, the late Ingrid Reed, had known the founder of TAPinto when he was a student at Rutgers, and said, this guy is an honest guy, and he's really concerned with local journalism, and he's not just a franchise guy trying to make a couple bucks. And so I signed on with the TAPinto franchise. So it's an independent, every TAPinto franchise is independent. And I call mine Princeton Community News. We circulate our information through TAPinto, and we're part of that network. But we really control our own destiny as far as what we print and what we don't print. Hopefully we get more in print and keep out.
Yeah. We'll say as an aside, I think you're doing a great job with TAPinto Princeton, because I think there's a lot of good news. There's a lot, and it's news that you can, and it's just not just news. It's news and information, but it's accurate and it's timely.
Yeah, thanks for that. The question of objectivity has come up, and I believe you start with facts. However, to say that you're totally objective is always a charade. You're making a subjective judgment when you decide to cover a story, or you decide there are some stories that come across council that I never mention.
Yeah.
Apologies for that. However, when I hear somebody say, as I just recently did last night at the planning board, we've got a plan for Harrison Street coming up on our radar at council. I say, now that to me is important. And a lot of people have been asking me. So that's a subjective judgment.
Yeah.
So I exercise that judgment. And then the other thing that I try to add in is context and a historical. When somebody says the traffic on Mercer Street has never been worse, it's so bad, and it's all these new people that are causing it, I say, let's go back and look at the Town Topics reports, some of which I wrote from the 1970s, the 1960s, and the 1950s, and you will find references to how bad the traffic is on Mercer Street.
Yeah.
We've got a vibrant downtown. Even then, people wanted to come in.
Yeah.
They wanted to come here to work.
I think it's the same people.
They look the same, but they have different cars.
So, seeing all you've done, is there something else coming up? Is there the next chapter? Or
I hope there may be another chapter. John McPhee writes that you need an old man project just to keep you from being something other than the old man. And so one thing I'm doing with TAPinto is trying to turn it into a community-owned, community benefit organization so that it is not the Rich Rein show anymore, but it becomes owned by a group of people living in town who have with bylaws that say that any surplus revenue goes back into creating content, so that we don't have a case that's happening to all too many newspapers. And one of our former well-esteemed newspapers in town this fate has visited upon them, where it's an absentee owner who looks at it and say, I'll cut the staff as much as I can, and I'll extract as much money in advertising as I can. And when the last advertiser checks out, then I'll check out too. I will squeeze the last bit of money out of it. So I'm trying to set up an ongoing, sustainable organization that can make its mission be good local news and pay and be sustainable. So that's the immediate goal. If I can pull that one off, then I'll turn and maybe there's an old man project beyond that.
There you go. I think it's really critical to have somewhere where you can go for accurate information about what's going on in town. And that we have the Town Topics.
Yep. And they fill that role. And
they do. They do quite a bit.
Yeah, they do a lot. And my vision for TAPinto Princeton Community News is in a way dependent on the other local media remaining in place.
Yeah.
It would be a real burden on the Princeton Community News TAPinto model to suddenly have to also do all the good stuff that the Town Topics is doing.
Yeah.
They can all work together, and nobody needs to go out of business for what I'm thinking about to survive.
Yeah.
Which is a nice thought.
Yeah. Good to hear. Okay. So Rich, we know you live in Princeton. What are your favorite aspects of being here in town?
I could answer one answer would be to just quote any number of people who show up at public meetings and will rhapsodize about how lovely Princeton is. It's the perfect combination. It's the small town, but it has these university aspects. It's just perfect the way it is. However, going back to the William H. White principle of don't be afraid of counterintuitive thinking, one of the things I really like is the fact that it's not perfect and that there are these lovely moments of contention that come together. And my heart goes out to our elected officials, incidentally, who sit there and I'm sure on some occasions bite their tongues at the contentious nature of some debates, way more contentious than the debate deserves. The topic doesn't deserve this much energy, but it's getting it. On the other hand, you look at it and you see the people who come, who are at the table, and in its way, it's like sports. It's being back at some little battlefield and watching the people go at it. And sometimes neither side is right in your mind. Sometimes both sides have a little bit going at them, but it's never boring. Let's put it that way. So you never know where the next exciting moment is going to come to. And when you go, and I don't need to tell the mayor this, but when you go to enough municipal meetings, they can sometimes be very predictable. However, in Princeton, we all know there's a hand grenade waiting. Hopefully nobody gets hurt. And then we can all smile when it's all over. So I'd say that's the imperfection of Princeton, despite its all perceived perfectness, is an appealing trait to the town.
That's great. I like that perspective. Thank you. Rich, I want to thank you for having been with us today. This is tremendous.
I've enjoyed being here. You've prompted some fresh thinking with your questions, and go Pittsburgh.
There you go.
thank you for joining us for the 55th episode of the Princeton Podcast, produced by the podcast production team at HG Media, providing audio and video production services here in Princeton since 1999. If you enjoyed this episode of the Princeton Podcast, please share it with your friends. Visit our website at princetonpodcast.com and be sure to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Podcasts, Amazon Music, or wherever you listen to podcasts.